Sermon 28, Israel at Mount Sinai.
The Old Testament scriptures is Moses at Mount Sinai. It took 60 days to the day for Moses and the children of Israel to go the short distance from the Red Sea over to assemble at the foot of Mount Sinai. When they arrived in the wilderness of Sinai, as the Bible talks about, Moses was called up to Mount Sinai so that God could give him the commandments. This day that he arrived is known as the beginning of the Feast of Weeks, or the Feast of Harvest, also called the Feast of Booths, or by its Hebrew name, if I can pronounce this correctly, Shavuot. This feast takes place in late spring. In the New Testament, we know this feast, I guess it's more popular to be called the Feast of Pentecost. And we know that because of the events that happened on the day of Pentecost in the New Testament. But the Feast of Pentecost, or the Feast of Weeks, or Harvest, or Feast of Booths, as it's called, was 50 days from Passover. And that is 50 days after Passover, then you had Pentecost. The word Sinai in the Hebrew language means cliffs. Basically, it was what we would say a small mountain out in the middle of a desert. And that's the way Sinai was pictured. It was believed by the ancestors of old, going all the way back to the time pre-flood, that many of the writers, as we would say the history writers, believed that the mountain itself was a miraculous mountain. There was something mysterious about it. We're introduced to it the first time with Moses, when Moses was keeping his father-in-law's sheep, and he noticed something up on the mountain. It was like a light that was just glowing, and as he made his approach to go up and see what it was, he realized that it was a bush that was burning. But yet it was strange because the bush was not being consumed by the fire. But it was just like a perpetual flame there burning. And a voice out of the bush told him to take off the shoes from off his feet, for the ground whereon thou standest is holy ground. Moses, when he brought the children out of Egyptian bondage, he brought them back to Mount Sinai. He brought them to the foot of the mountain. 2 months to the day that they crossed the Red Sea and received their freedom. When they get to Mount Sinai, God calls Moses up on the mountain, and he appears to Moses. Moses went up to God, and God said to Moses, I want you to say to the children of Jacob, to the children of Israel, that you've seen what I did in Egypt. That is, you've been witness to all the miracles that were performed there. And how he says, I carried you on eagle's wings, and brought you out unto myself. Now that's what God said. Israel didn't do it. There wasn't anything that they did to be able to free themselves from that bondage. God did all of that. He performed all of those miracles. And he brought them out, carried them out on eagle's wings, and he brought them to himself. He says, now, if you will obey me fully, not just partial obedience, but if you will obey me fully and keep my commandments, then out of all the nations, that is, all the people that dwell upon the earth, you'll be my treasured possession. Now that's God's promise to Israel. That if you'll fully obey me and keep my commandments, then you'll be my treasured possession. He said, although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And these are the words he told Moses, that you go down the mountain now and you tell the children of Israel. And you go down and repeat what I've told you. So Moses goes down the mountain and he relays the message that God gave him to the children of Israel. And when he gets down to the bottom of the mountain, he calls together the elders and he calls together the people and he tells them what God said. And the people all together respond, we will do everything the Lord has said. So Moses then leaves the children of Israel and goes back up on the mountain and he tells God, they said they'll do it. They said they'll do it. Now that's the opening to the story at Mount Sinai. That God says to the children of Israel that if you will fully keep my commandments, of all the people on the earth, you'll be my people. And I say that to you to remind you that throughout the Bible from now on, the children of Israel on many occasions will brag about being God's people. But what they failed to realize, they lost that right. Many, many times they lost that right. Because God said, in order to be my special people, you have to keep my commandments. And you know, as God's children today, it's the same way. People says, oh, you know, once a Christian, always a Christian. But you're only a Christian that's pleasing and acceptable in the sight of God when you're keeping his commandments. If you love me, keep my commandments. Not in a loving relationship with God if you're not keeping those commandments. So at the foot of Mount Sinai, God gives Moses, as we might say, the introduction to what he's about to do. And he says, you have to promise now that you'll fully keep my commandments. And then Moses goes back up on the mountain and he gives God the answer from Israel, we'll do everything you say. We'll do everything you say. And so the Lord says to Moses, I want you to go back down to the mountain and I want you to tell the people, prepare yourself. Prepare yourself to present yourself before me. In 3 days, you've got 3 days to do this. You've got 3 days to consecrate yourself. And God also says to Moses, I'm going to set limits around the mountain. And the people cannot trespass those limits. They have to pay attention. They have to be careful that they do not trespass the limits. Because if they try to come up on the mountain to see, you know how curiosity is. Said it killed the cat. Well, it'll kill the Israelite. That's what God said. If you go across the boundaries that are set, that I say you cannot go past, then you will be put to death. And it doesn't matter if it's man, woman, child, or beast. The punishment for crossing the boundary is death. He'll surely be stoned or shot through with arrows. Not a hand will be laid on him. Whether man or animal, he shall not be permitted to live. Only when the ram's horn sounds a long blast may they go up to the mountain. You can't go, you can't assemble, you can't get ready to hear what God has to say until you hear the ram's horn. The rest of the time, you just don't be busybodies and sticking your nose where it don't belong. Stay where you need to be. Now that's what God told Moses to do, and he sends Moses back down the mountain. And when Moses was gone down the mountain, he consecrated the people. He made them wash their clothes. He made them prepare themselves to present themselves before God And he told the husbands, do not go in unto your wives. You cannot have sexual relationships for 3 days. You make yourself clean to present yourself. And on the morning of the 3rd day, the Bible says that there was thunder, there was lightning, there was a thick cloud on the mountain, and the trumpets blasted very loud. Now you can kind of picture this in your mind, what's going on. And it says that everyone in the camp trembled. Now I'd be afraid too. I would be afraid too. They're about to stand, is what we would say, in the presence of God. And they are trembling. They are afraid. Now, when I was reading through and studying this, I could not help to think about what judgment will be like. When Jesus comes back, and the Bible says, and the trumpet shall sound, and then there will be a shout that will be heard around the inhabited earth. And thinking about that and thinking about what happened here as all these events took place and the people trembled. And it says that Mount Sinai was covered with smoke, and the Lord descended on it in fire. The smoke bellowed up from it like smoke from a furnace. The whole mountain trembled violently, about like what you would picture an earthquake. The sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder. And then Moses spoke to God, and God answered Moses. And the people heard Moses talking to God. And God calls Moses back up on the mountain, up to the top of the mountain. Now you think about this for a moment. All the people are afraid. And Moses is told, you come up the mountain. You come up the mountain. And Moses goes back up the mountain. And God again tells Moses to go down and warn the people. You go down and you warn the people again that they do not try to break through and see what's going on the mountain, because many of them will perish. He said, even the priests who approach unto the Lord, they must consecrate themselves, or the Lord will break out against them. God says they'll all die. You need to go down and you need to go and tell them. And Moses said to the Lord, I guess he misunderstood what God was saying, because he said to the Lord, the people cannot come up to Mount Sinai because you yourself warned us you can't cross the boundaries. You can't cross it. But God's just giving him another warning. I done told you what's going to happen. Now I want to reinforce that, tell you go back down there and tell the people, don't do this. Don't do this. And so Moses tells the Lord, you've already told us that we can't do this. And the Lord said, all right, you go down and you bring Aaron up with you. And so Moses goes back down and he brings Aaron with him up on the mount to receive the law of God. When we as mankind think about receiving of the law of Moses, usually the only thing that we think about are the 10 Commandments. The movie with Charlton Heston, the 10 Commandments, was Moses going up on the mountain. And there in the movie it talks about Moses receiving the 10 Commandments, and it quotes for us in the movie, the 10 Commandments, where the Lord spake these words, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourselves an image in the form of anything in heaven, or anything that is on earth, or anything that's in the waters beneath the earth. You shall not bow down to them, worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sins of the fathers to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations to those that love me and keep my commandments. He said, you shall not misuse, or as we have often heard, you shall not take the Lord's name in vain. That you shall not misuse his name, and the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do your work, he said, but on the seventh day, which is the Lord's Sabbath, ye shall not do any work, neither you nor your sons or daughters or your manservant or your maidservant, nor your animals, nor aliens that are within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and all that is in them, and he said, he rested on the seventh day, and therefore the Lord blessed the seventh day and made it the Sabbath day, and he made it holy, and he told the people to rest on the day. Now, important to notice here that the Ten Commandments, as we know them, this was not really the first time that the Ten Commandments had been used. They were fundamental principles in the patriarchal law. This was, in giving the law to the children of Israel, will not be the first time that priests are commissioned, because there were priests before. Aaron and the tribe of Levites became the priests for the children of Israel. You may remember when Abraham was returning from the slaughter of the kings, he was met by a priest of God. You may remember Jethro, who was Moses' father-in-law. He was a priest of God. And so the laws that governed, and many of the laws that God would now give to the children of Israel as an outline of what we know as the Ten Commandments, were also contained under the patriarchal law, and many of them, with the exception of remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, was brought into the Christian system of law. That all of the things that we talk about in the Ten Commandments, with that one exception, is brought over, and we are to obey those laws even today. But tonight, I don't have time to go into all the different laws, but I do want to cover them. When people talk about keeping the law of God, my lesson next week will be based on so you want to keep Moses' law. And I think it's going to be a very interesting lesson, because usually when people get to dealing with the law of Moses, they sort of skip over that. They hit the 10 Commandments that we've mentioned tonight, and they forget about all the rest. I don't know if anyone's ever gone through and numbered all the laws that God gave Moses and Aaron to give to the children of Israel, but there are a lot more than 10. A lot more than 10. And we will go through and listen to them. But tonight I want to talk briefly about 3 things that God gave to the children of Israel there on Mount Sinai in making preparation, and that is the 3 annual feasts that they had to go to. That 3 times a year they had to celebrate a festival to God. You know, we have our festivals today, our Slugburger Festival and our Strawberry Festivals and whatever, people, celebrate different festivals. Well, the children of Israel were commanded that 3 times a year they had feasts that they had to celebrate. There was the Feast of Unleavened Bread. We've known that in connection with the Passover. And that is, during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, they were not to have any yeast in their house. That they had to eat unleavened bread. And it was a very serious thing that the Jewish people would literally search their houses and make sure there was no leaven in their houses, and they would get rid of it. And they would do this during the time for 7 days during the Feast of Unleavened Bread to make preparation for the Passover. They would have to keep this. And he said, no one is to appear before me empty-handed. That is, everyone has a responsibility here. It's not something that just the priest are to do, but everyone had this responsibility. If there was a sojourner among the children of Israel, they were also guided by these laws, and they could not violate them, and the children of Israel could not allow them to be violated. So this was in addition to the Ten Commandments. These were laws that they had to keep that pertained to the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Then he said that they were to celebrate the Feast of Harvest. That is, with the first fruits of crops that they would grow. That in the springtime, when they would grow their gardens like you and I grow, when we would go out to gather the fruits from our garden, the very first ripe tomatoes, the very first cucumbers, the very first peas, the very first corn, the very first potatoes, the very first lettuce, the very first greens, everything that was first belonged to God. And it was to be given unto God. He required it of the children of Israel. And they would celebrate the feast. The harvest of the first fruits of the crop, they had to celebrate. The Feast of the Ingatherings was also another feast that they had to celebrate, and this was at the end of the year when they would gather in all of their crops, and they would bring in their bounty, as we would say, and they would fill up their storehouses and their barns. They were to take time that they would stop, and they would have another feast, and they would celebrate, and they would make sacrifice unto God, and they would remember the goodness of God. So God said to them at 3 times a year, all the men are to appear before the sovereign Lord, not to offer the blood of sacrifice to me only in anything that contains yeast. That is, you can't offer sacrifice in anything that has yeast in it. He said, the fat of my festivals, that is, the sacrifices that you're going to offer, you can't keep them to the next day. You know, if you offer something, then it has to be destroyed that day. If you don't consume it, if it was a sacrifice that was to be consumed, and you could not consume all of it, it was to be destroyed that day. You did not bring it over to the next day. And he said also that you are to bring the best of the first fruits of your soil to the house of the Lord your God. Now that's a very important to remember, because God says, I want your best. I want your first. I want your best. And when they were giving unto God, they couldn't go through their potatoes, and they couldn't go through their cattle, and they couldn't go through their sheep and goats, and they were not allowed to go out and look and say, that old cow over there is not any good, I'm just going to give her to God. They couldn't do that. God said the first one, if you got you a new cow and she's with calf, the first one belongs to me. That's mine. That's mine. And these were the feasts that he said, that God was giving. Then he goes in and Moses breaks it down for the people so that they can understand about the feast. And he talks about, the Passover. And of course, we've gone through the Passover, and we know what was required and how they had to make preparation, and how the animal had to be put up for so many days, and it had to be killed, and the blood had to be put on the top and on the sides of the doors. And God said to Moses, that in connection with this, you have the Feast of Weeks. He said, on the day of first fruits, when you present to a Lord an offering of new grain during the Feast of Weeks, he said, hold sacrifice, assembly, and do not work. And that is another day off. Not just a Sabbath day that you're to keep once a week, but during the Feast of Weeks, you take another day off. You don't do any work. You present a burnt offering of 2 young bulls, 1 ram, 7 male lambs of a year old, an aroma pleasing to the Lord. With each bull there shall be grain offered of 3/10 of an ephah of a fine flour mixed with oil with the ram, 2/10, and with each of the 7 lambs 1/10. He breaks it down. With every sacrifice that was to be offered, with every animal was to be offered, there was to be a grain offering. Was to be a grain offering. And this would be the first that belonged to God. And the priests would gather this from the people, and they would use this to offer. And not only was there to be an animal sacrifice and a grain offering, there would also be a drink offering that would be presented with this. And they would present this in addition to the regular burnt offering. They would present unto God the fruit of the vine, if you please. So these things had to be presented to God. Note the Feast of Weeks, or Shavuot in the New Testament, as I mentioned, is called Pentecost. So 50 days after Passover, they were to have the Feast of Weeks. And then they had what was called the Feast of Trumpets. Yaham Turah, if Turah is the correct pronunciation of that. This was on the first day of the 7th month. That is, after you had, as we say, Pentecost, then in the 7th month, they had the Feast of Trumpets. And the trumpets were sounded so that the people would assemble and they would have another day off. They couldn't work on this day. It was set aside for God, for them to offer sacrifice, and they would basically go through again offering the same type of sacrifice that they had offered on the other feast day, along with the grain and along with the drink offering. And this is what the priest had gathered from the people, what they had collected from the people, that they would offer unto God. And what they had collected from the people was the best that the people had to offer. The firstlings of the flock, the first fruits of their labor that came out of their gardens and from their crops. And in addition to this, they had to offer a ram that was a sin offering. And they had to do this at every feast. And they had to prepare, as Moses would go into great detail, on how to prepare this sin offering. And that's a reason that the New Testament would say it's impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sin. Because with each of their feasts, they would have to offer a sin offering. Not only were they having a feast of thanksgiving and blessing for what God had done for them and had given them and had delivered them from the Egyptian bondage and the memorial that they would give, but in the midst of all that, they would have to offer a sin offering and do it as God had instructed them. And so in the Feast of Trumpets, and the trumpet would sound, and they would offer unto God those things. And then and there was another feast that followed that was called the Day of Atonement. The Jewish people, and I know you've probably heard this one, they called it Yom Kippur. You'll see it on TV sometimes. Jewish people celebrating Yom Kippur. Basically the same thing would be presented, that on the 10th day of the 7th month, they would have Yom Kippur and they would have a day off. And this was a day that they would deny themselves. That is, a husband and wife could not be together on this day. They were to deny themselves because they would have to remember that what God has done for them. And then, of course, they would have to offer the sacrifices that they would offer in the other feast days. And then they had another feast. In addition to the Day of Atonement was the Feast of Tabernacles that they would have to observe. This was on the 15th day of the 7th month. So as you see, they would have each of these days that they were set aside, that they would have to make preparation, if you please, for the big day. And each of these days had to be observed. And it says on the 15th day of the 7th month, they were to hold a sacred assembly, and they were to do no work. Again, they were not to work that day. They're to celebrate a festival to the Lord for 7 days. Present an offering made by fire. A burnt offering of 13 young bulls, 2 rams, 14 male lambs, a year old, all without defect or blemish. And each of the 13 bulls were to be prepared again with the grain offering, with the drink offering. See, it just wasn't going out and just sacrificing an animal as some thought. And so people today, when they talk about keeping the law of Moses, have no idea what was involved in keeping this law that Moses received from Mount Sinai. Notice, if you will, briefly, and I'm not going to cover everything that's in there, but on the 3rd day, they had to prepare 11 bulls in addition to the rams and the male lambs, and the grain offering and the drink offering. On the 4th day, they had to prepare 10 bulls. On the 5th day, they had to prepare 9 bulls. And all of these were in addition to the other animals. On the 6th day, they were to prepare 8 bulls. On the 7th day, they were to prepare 7 bulls. And, this went on and on and on during the feast, that each day, and on the 8th day, they were to hold an assembly, and again, they were to do no work. We sometimes talk about holidays. They had a lot of holidays, a lot of days that they had to take off. And they had to present this to God. And so God said, these are 3 feasts that you'll keep every year. But it wasn't just these 3 days. It was all the days that led up to this and all the little individual feasts that they had to keep in order to make preparation for Passover, for Pentecost, and for the Feast of Harvest. And so they had all these feasts that they would have to do, and all the sacrifices that they would have to make. And Moses told all the children of Israel, you do this every year. You do this every year. Starting with the first month, the month Abib, you do this every year. And so when someone says, you Church of Christ people, y'all just don't believe the Old Testament. Y'all just don't keep the law of Moses. Brethren, I say to you tonight, do you know anybody that keeps the law of Moses? Anybody? In our life, have you ever seen anybody keep the law of Moses? The Jewish people, even in their time, did not keep the law of Moses. The Hebrew writer Paul, when he was writing the Hebrews, said, if it had been possible to have a law that could have freed man from sin, it would have been the law of Moses. It would have been. Because you just think about all the things that God required of the children of Israel that they had to do in order to keep the law that he gave from Mount Sinai. And this just touches the hem of the garment. This is just a beginning, and that's just the feast. That just touches the hem of the garment. That's in addition to the 10 Commandments that I read for you just a moment ago. So the next time someone says, you folks don't keep the law, think about this. And then next week we'll talk about a lot of the laws that some you probably heard and some you probably haven't heard. Because just like me, when I used to read the Old Testament, I'd skip all that part. Because it's just a list of all the laws they had to keep. And all the things that they had to do. If you're here tonight and need to respond to the invitation, won't you do so while we stand and while we sing?